are the Fed policies working? And there's a couple of ways to look at it. I like to do an exercise where we use an expansion chart. And I want to first look at economic growth. On these expansion chart, the dashed line at the top is the best recovery. The dotted line at the bottom is the worst, and the solid line in the middle is the average recovery. As you can see, looking at just the economic growth, we are at a place that is worse at this point in time than we've ever seen before since World War II. It's almost as bad when we look at employment. Employment continues to track a level that we haven't seen except during the double dip recession in the early 1980s. This chart, if you look at that dashed line at the bottom, that's actually 2 recessions, because normally employment has recovered everything about 12 months after the end of the recession. And now we're going on about 37 months since the recession officially ended, and yet we've only gained 2.5% more jobs than we had at the end of the recession. The bigger problem I see than just employment is the fact that personal income has not come anywhere close to tracking where it should have been. So when people question how anybody can say the economy is recovering, it's probably because, 1, job growth has been so slow, but 2, because that personal income growth is the worst we've seen since World War II. And it's been very painful to people because they see the stock market rising, but their incomes are not rising. So why are these policies not working? That's something I really thought Ben Bernanke would be asking himself, and he would be doing more speeches on. And what really concerns me is the ideas that they've had to fix the economy have been the same thing they've been trying since 2008. And they've failed to see one key concept. And we're going to look at the Federal Reserve balance sheet. The solid line at the top is the size of their balance sheet. And that's really important because you can see on that chart that we had a small quantitative easing. They weren't even calling it quantitative easing back in 2008. And then they had what was officially quantitative easing 1, followed by a short break, and then quantitative easing 2. What's important to look at is comparing the solid blue line to the dashed red line. You can see that the reserve balances that the banks held at the Federal Reserve, I like to think of them as a savings account the banks have. The banks basically were taking the money the Fed was creating and putting it on deposit with the Federal Reserve. And that means that all the money that the Fed created had been hoarded by the banks. Now, the other issue the Fed is having, and another thing why their policies aren't working, is the level of debt that both the U.S. government and households have accumulated. You could see the green line is GDP growth, and it's been growing at a very steady rate. It's actually about a 3.1% annual growth rate going all the way back to 1947. And it rarely would get above or below that trend line. But if you look at beginning around 1980, both household debt and public debt started going exponential. And then by the 90s, it was going parabolic. That's a big concern because those tools the Federal Reserve are using are tools that are supposed to encourage more debt, which would encourage people to spend more money, which is supposed to get us out of a recession or get us back towards strong economic growth. But because both households and the U.S. government already had so much debt, households don't have an appetite for debt, and the borrowing that the federal government keeps doing is not enough to stimulate the economy and get it into the system so people are spending money again. I will say there is a little bit of an encouraging sign. If you look at that purple line, which is household debt, you can see it has declined since the recession started. So let's zoom in a little bit and see what represents that decline. This chart here shows the level of consumer debt, and it breaks it out. We have mortgages, which is the orange bars, and you could see that since the peak, the level of mortgage debt has declined. Then you have the purple line, which is home equity loans. Those have remained about the same. People are unable most of the time to take out additional home equity loans, but they also haven't been able to refinance those things because of what's happened to housing prices. The green is auto loans, and you could see, which is a good thing, they've declined a little bit. You look at the size of the bars. The blue lines are credit cards. Again, they've declined a little bit. The problem I see is those red bars. That is student loan debt. And you could see how small it was back in 2003. You could barely see that red square there. And then when you look at the most recent data, that totals almost $1 trillion worth of student loan debt. Now this starts to become an issue and another problem for the Federal Reserve, because as the baby boomers retire, they're going to be spending less money. In a normal cycle, if this was just a cyclical slowdown, you would see the younger families starting to pick up the consumer spending. You think of, the soccer moms and the football moms and all the families that are starting and how much money they spend versus a retiree. The issue we're seeing is families are being delayed because, one, unemployment remains very high. The growth we're seeing in jobs are jobs that are not paying enough, and that's where it shows up in the personal income data that we talked about earlier. But number three, they have so much in student loans, they either don't feel like they can start a family, or if they do, they're not spending as much. So the Fed policies are not working because we have too much debt, and the banks are hoarding the money.